Welcome to Dialogue on Public Issues. I'm John Chowney with Campbellsville University. Each year, Campbellsville University during the fall semester engages in a process called Dialogue on Race. This process started back in the fall of 1999, and for 2 decades, with intentionality, the university family has, with the community in partnership, has been working to enhance better communication and understanding between people across lines of race and ethnicity, language, etc. Each year we bring in a keynote speaker and chapel speaker in October to address those issues. And I'm very pleased to have a person who has deep roots in Campbellsville, Taylor County, Dr. David Goatley. Dr. Goatley, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Chowning. It's a joy to be back in Campbellsville on the university campus and talking with you today.
Well, there may be some watching and listening that may not be familiar with your ties to Campbellsville. Tell us about that.
Well, first I was introduced to Campbellsville in 1983 and then came back in 1986. I was called to serve as pastor for the First Baptist Church in Campbellsville. It's my privilege to serve them from 1986 to 1995 and developed a number of relationships and partnerships and friendships in the community. Also, I was blessed to meet and marry my wife, who was Pamela Curry at that time. And also while we were here and serving First Baptist Church, our son was born. So Campbellsville has been a blessing in my life and one of the places that I call home with warmth and with affection.
Now, you're a native of Louisville, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I grew up in Louisville, and I spent 4 years in Eminence, Kentucky, in Henry County. My father was a pastor there at the First Baptist Church in Eminence for 47 years.
Wow.
So I spent my high school years there, but I was born in Louisville and spent years before high school there. Then I returned after high school to earn degrees at the University of Louisville and then later at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
After you left Campbellsville, you went to Memphis Theological Seminary, I believe, and was a professor there?
Yes, I went there. I was assistant professor of theology at Memphis Theological Seminary, and I was there for 2 years. And then following that, I accepted a call to go to Washington, D.C., where for 22 years it was my privilege to serve as the executive secretary treasurer, as the chief executive officer for the Lot Carey Baptist Foreign Mission Society. It was a global mission community that was organized in 1897. And the purpose of that organization is to help churches to extend the Christian witness throughout the world. So the primary way that we operate with the Lot Carey Society is to provide prayer partnership, financial assistance, and technical support for indigenously led ministries in the global south primarily, who are involved in ministries of evangelism, compassion, empowerment, and advocacy. And so after being there for 22 years, then the Lord called me to do something else. And so for the last 15 months, I've been with Duke Divinity School in Durham University, where I'm a research professor of theology and Black Church Studies, and also in an administrative post, serve as a director of the Office of Black Church Studies, which was initially founded in 1972 on the Duke campus. So in the next 3 years, we'll be celebrating our 50th year.
Now, to back up to Lot Carey, how many countries does Lot Carey operate in now, approximately?
Well, we have partnerships of some kind in about 24.
Okay.
Regular ongoing program that continue year after year is going in about 12 countries presently. But depending on what kinds of projects, so for example, because of recent hurricane activity in the Caribbean, we had expanded some of our relationships and partnerships there. Sometimes if there's a unique need, some part of the world, for example, in Mozambique. A few years ago, we were involved in providing both wells, and in one community was called a maize grinder. So it's a piece of machinery that grinds corn, because one of the problems in the global south is the disproportionality of labor, where women do a disproportionate amount of the physical labor. So you'd have women who are growing corn, and they'd have to put it in baskets on their head and walk for miles to the nearest maize grinder to grind up the kernels into powdery maize, which is used as a staple food. And then after standing in line for that, then they'd have to put it back on their head and walk hours back again home. And then once they got there, then they had all kinds of chores waiting on them. So we were able to work with a network of churches and put a maize grinder in the church community to help lessen the burden on women. So those are examples of different kind of projects that will rise up. We finish the project and then we close it down. But we maintain relationships and friendships, because mission done right, we believe, is not transactional. So that you build it around a project, then when the project is over, it's finished. But there are ways of being supportive and engaged even when you're not financing a specific project.
Now, in terms of your appointment 15 months ago at Divinity School, tell us a little more about the work there that you're doing, both as a professor, research professor of theology, and then as director of the Office of Black Church Studies.
Sure. Well, part of the role is teaching, and so I teach in the theology division. And I've been teaching in various programs. So I've taught in the Master of Divinity program, which is the core program for people preparing for ministry's vocation as pastors or chaplains or the like. We also have a Master of Arts in Christian Practice, which is a hybrid program. Most of the people there are either second career or on church staffs. They're not able to leave and be in a residential program, but they spend 3 weeks on campus, and then the rest of it is done online. So it's a hybrid program. We also do, Duke is historically connected with the United Methodist Church, and the standard trajectory for ordination is to have a Master of Divinity as your base theological degree. But there are a number of people who are pastors and serves, and they may have studied something else or had a baccalaureate degree and either chose not or were not able to do the traditional Master of Divinity. So there's an alternative course of study program. So the course of study, people do it either on weekends or perhaps a couple of weeks in the summer and then online. That's a fun project because these are people who are actual acting pastors and practicing pastors. So even the questions that arise and the way that they engage material and the way they interrogate a text is very different than a student who is 24 years old who is in a course and does not have kind of the professional or personal experiences. Right. And then I also teach in the Doctor of Ministry program, which is for practitioners who are doing a terminal degree for pastors. And then we have some Doctor of Theology students. So I'm teaching in across the board in those ways, primarily around theology and leadership. The Office of Black Church Studies has a curricular oversight function. So at Duke Divinity School for a number of decades, part of the requirement of a graduation, of earning the degree, is to take at least one course in Black Church Studies. That's a part of what we feel is helping to form pastors to do good and faithful ministry. We also host 3 annual lectures, one primarily around preaching and congregational ministry, one around women and faith and justice, and then a third around the church and public theology, public witness. Also trying to work with congregations to build more opportunities for field placement and field engagement. We recently announced a new project, however, that I'm very excited about, and I'll be the project director on, and that is the Duke Divinity School Black Pastoral Leadership Collaboration. We'll be doing a multi-year, multidisciplinary research project to discover key strategies, successes, and setbacks of pastoral leaders in 3 eras. One is the Reconstruction era, when churches were trying to contribute to nation building and civic participation. The Civil Rights era, when a number of churches were trying to do institution building for racial uplift. And then the 3rd era is the first couple of decades of the megachurch movement, when churches were aggregating numbers and resources to amplify their impact. And so the idea is to do a deep dive, multidisciplinary study in terms of leadership, and then to try to anticipate some of the key issues and indicators that will help us to do good leadership. We also will be convening pastors who have done research and publications in the applied practical ministry. And then we also will be creating some annual training for pastors around thinking with some theological constructive approaches for their ministry. So we're excited about that 5-year project that should produce good information and learning from the Black church for the whole church.
Will there be publications forthcoming from that research project, I presume?
Yes, there will be one major theological text that will come from the multidisciplinary study around leadership. There will be a series of smaller texts in terms of Black pastoral leadership for applied theology. And then we'll also be working with some other platforms to do electronic publication that can be done in shorter amounts of time and get it out faster to communities.
Are there other areas that you'll be working on research as the theology research professor?
Yeah, well, my key areas of interest and research is at the intersection of liberation theologies, contemporary missiologies, and leadership strategies. And so I think that leading effectively and faithfully requires serious theological reflection that is liberating and not constricting and not oppressing, and that we are involved in the mission of God in the world. So we need to do theology that comes from the grassroots up rather than imposed down by privilege, and to be involved wherever God is working. We join God there, all over the world, particularly in the global South where there's a lot of energy. So my research projects are going to be at that intersection of theology, missiology, and leadership strategy.
Okay. Now, time limits of this interview don't allow us to explore this particular topic I'm going to ask in depth, but I think it's important to note the importance of the church in the Black experience in America. And how would you summarize that in just the confines of this particular interview and setting?
Yeah. Well, the church in an earlier age was what the Afro-Canadian ethicist Peter Paris called the womb of the community. The Black church was the cultural womb of the community. So it was a place for spiritual fortitude. It was a place of thinking about and interrogating the issues and ideas that were informing the way that people were living and the experiences that they had. It was where young people learned to develop their gifts and talents. It's a different now, but up until about 15 years or so ago, when you would have the seminal Black artists, most of them got started in the church, whether they were performers or singers or musicians or artists in terms of visual arts and the written arts. And so that was, for a long time, a role of the church. Now there are a lot of places that people are learning skills and developing and maturing. But what the church is today, however, is it is the one local institution where black people are welcome and affirmed and nurtured. Mm-hmm. That is, when it's working the way it should be working. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are a number of times where the sinfulness of humanity manifests itself, mm-hmm. and people do not live up to the expectations that Jesus has of mm-hmm. us. But when we're at our best, we continue to provide spiritual support, ministry, encouragement, affirmation. We aggregate resources that can be applied in meaningful ways for community building and making people whole again. So the Black church is still a connecting point and a resource, mm-hmm. and most of all, it is the principal instrument through which Jesus incarnates himself, mm-hmm. To bear good and faithful witness in the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the Black church, is there a particular denomination or group within the overall Black church in America, I'm speaking of, that is at the forefront today, that's growing faster than any other particular group or denominational affiliation?
Yeah, well, the Black church is heterogeneous, just mm-hmm. like the white church, right. But churches all over the United States and all over the world that are growing the most are churches that identify themselves more as Pentecostal mm-hmm. or charismatic.
Okay.
And so wherever you are in the world, for the most part, where the church is growing and expanding and experiencing what they and other observers would call vibrancy, mm-hmm. are churches that are in the more charismatic or Pentecostal movements. Now, denominations are reconfiguring. There are mm-hmm. some people saying that they're going away. My hunch is that they're reconfiguring, and that, so for example, there are like charismatic groups and movements that cut across
right.
traditional historic denominational lines. And I think that as we go forward, we're likely to find more of that denomination, mm-hmm. commonality, mm-hmm. that is more in terms of the expression of worship and the manifestation of spirits, as well as some of the theology. So in Black church life, those that are more charismatic and Pentecostal seem by and large to be those that are growing more.
Mm-hmm. And as I understand, that's the case with the church as a whole.
Yeah, all over the world.
Globally.
When you go around the world, where the church seems to be most vibrant and where it seems to be growing, are churches that embrace either charismatic approaches, mm-hmm. The manifestation of spiritual gifts and emotive and expressive and contemporary worship styles, or Pentecostal. That is where the church seems to be growing wherever you are in the world, mm-hmm. including the United States, which some people don't think that the United States is part of the world, but we're just like everyone else. And so Pentecostal charismatic churches in the United States seem to be growing and showing signs of vitality and mm-hmm. energy and hope, more so than most of the other churches.
What would you say, Dr. Goatley, are the major challenges facing the Black church today?
Well, I think the major challenges, the first one, I think, is the ongoing pervasiveness of racism and mm-hmm. structural racism. Because when structural racism involves policies, mm-hmm. institutions, and cultural narratives that all work together to perpetuate privilege for people who are born white. They just inherit privileges, and to continue to penalize and or oppress people of color, particularly people whose heritage may be related to Africa, Asia, the Americas and the Arab world. So on this ongoing negotiation of racism, where there's a presumption of the superiority of people because they're white, and a presumption of inferiority of people because they are black or people of color. That is an ongoing problem that we have to negotiate. But there are others that we have to do that are affecting the church at large and the world at large. So there is the political fragmentation, the breaking off of communities in a broad national political way. And I'm not talking about just partisanship,
Right.
but there's this breaking off, and it happens by people who wield power in terms of institutions and communication platforms. That's a problem. A growing self-segmentation. People seem to be forming themselves around circles of people who are most like them. You know, they only talk to people who agree with them. They only look at media that they are predisposed to agree with. It's all the same. It's very incestuous and closed and stale. We're having to deal with what do you do with economic stagnation? And that's affecting the whole country and the world. When I was a young man, I assumed that all things being equal, I would economically be in a more affluent position than my parents. My young adult child cannot assume that because of just the way the economics are. They're stagnant for the masses of people. Most people they haven't made any ground. And that cuts across but that cuts across all areas. So that has implications for planning, for community, for thriving, for how do you provide for your young people. If you're a young person and you're graduating with all of this debt from higher education, and your income is not going to continue to increase, and you just got those handcuffs and that burden of debt. And it's complicated and exacerbated for people of color because of the history of racism and the history of stolen labor and stolen wealth. So in the days of slavery, for example, all over the South, this agricultural economy that was booming and providing resources and food for the world and to export, the people who did that labor did not get paid for their labor. So their labor was stolen. They were not able to earn and buy and invest and etc. And then even after slavery, there were times where people's labor was stolen. They would not be paid, but they did not have any recourse because legally they were considered less than human and not deserving. And even today, it's documented that people of color with the same education, the same experience, the same opportunities, do not make dollar for dollar the same amount as our white siblings. And it's also complicated with gender. So the economic stagnation that everybody faces is exacerbated for people of color. Those are some of the examples. The last thing I want to talk about is the problem of ecological degradation. So there's a growing language and information segment that talks about environmental racism, where there are pollutants in the air of people of color, not exclusively, but particularly, because wherever there are poor people, then they're more exposed to ecological degradation. I grew up in Kentucky, and people who lived and live in places where coal was mined. There's a lot of ecological degradation and ongoing health concerns, etc. So that is a particular problem because in urban settings where African Americans are concentrated, also the way that loans have been structured and the way that communities have been planned in terms of the zoning and the planning and the way that finances are done and developers, then what they've done is they normally have avoided places where there's been a concentration of African Americans. And so if you underdevelop there, you undevelop in quality of life. So just things like parks, trees, and fresh water, those things are not accessible for where a number of people are. So those are, some of the kinds of experiences. So the challenges that face anybody in the country, they're going to face us all. But when you have to deal with a history of having to negotiate with your white siblings who inherit benefit unearned, and then black siblings who are presumed to be problematic or not deserving, then that exacerbates the problem that everybody has to deal with.
To what extent in the black church, it is certainly in the church as a whole, I think, but specifically we're talking about the black church primarily, is the generational divide an issue? In other words, millennials and even Generation Z increasingly missing and absent. Is that an issue?
It is an issue, but it's not. It does not seem to be the same kind of issue. So, for example, when you read information about millennials are leaving the church and not interested in the church, the data set on that is not normally including African American Christians. Okay. Now, the numbers are not as robust as we would like for them to be, but there are a number of examples where there are millennials or Gen Xers who are still very much engaged in the life of the church. I think the key thing is, our church is willing to adapt to the use of technology,
right,
to the ways of processing, to adolescent development. So to be able, to sit in a 2.5 hour worship service on a Sunday morning, probably not going to appeal to a millennial.
Dr. Goatley, we're out of time. Any closing comments?
Well, it's always good to be at Campbellsville University, and we're excited about the ongoing growth, thankful for the dialogue around race and the courage and creativity that it takes to do that kind of work. And we have to keep working at this so we can get it right.
Amen. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for
Wish
the privilege.
you Godspeed and the very best at Duke Divinity School in all your pursuits.
Thank you much.
We'll have you back again soon.
We'll look forward to it.
This is John Chowning with our very good friend here at Campbellsville University, Dr. David Goatley with Duke Divinity School, thanking our audience for being with us for dialogue on public issues. Thank you.